Chapter 6. A Promise. "What did she do with the note, Grandpa?" I asked. I could not wait to hear what happened next. She quickly put it back where Sir Andrew had dropped it, then lay down on the sofa. Just in time. A moment later, Sir Andrew came back with a glass of water. As Margot opened her eyes to thank him, she saw that the note had disappeared. Sir Andrew was certainly a gentleman, but he never forgot his duty to the League. As the clock above the fireplace struck midnight, Margot suddenly realized that the moment had come to save her brother. But did she have to send the Scarlet Pimpernel to the guillotine? Her eyes met Chauvelin's across the room. He knew Margot had discovered something. Chauvelin moved silently towards his prey. "I believe you have something to tell me," he said menacingly. "I'm only doing this to save my brother's life," Margot cried. She told Chauvelin about the note. "Excellent," he exclaimed. "All we have to do now is wait." At 1:45, Chauvelin went into the dining room. Margot's poor husband was lying on the sofa, snoring loudly. Chauvelin decided to follow Sir Percy's example, and soon he too was asleep. "I can just imagine the scene, Grandpa. I'm sure poor Margot was so worried." "That's right. She was waiting impatiently for Chauvelin to discover the Scarlet Pimpernel. She felt terribly guilty, and she wanted to know who the victim of the terrible plot was. Suddenly, she saw Lord Hastings leaving the dining room. She rushed towards him. "Did you see anyone in there, my friend?" she asked anxiously. "Well now, apart from your husband, my dear, there was only that Frenchman who works for the committee, and he was asleep." "Yes, that's Chauvelin. But wasn't there anyone else?" "No." Margot still wasn't satisfied. "What time did you go into the dining room, Lord Hastings?" "Why are you asking me all these questions?" he replied, irritated. "I don't know. About 1:05. "Why was Margot still so worried?" I asked Grandpa. "Well, it was quite understandable. If Chauvelin doesn't find the Scarlet Pimpernel, my brother will go to the guillotine," she thought. She was still worrying about him as she walked to her carriage, with Chauvelin following her. Sir Percy walked sleepily behind them. "Chauvelin, I must know what happened," Margot whispered. Nothing. No one came into the room. "Does that mean the plan failed?" she asked anxiously. Perhaps. "Stop torturing me, Chauvelin. What about poor Armand?" "His life is hanging by a thread. We must wait for the Scarlet Pimpernel to leave, as he said in his message. I must leave for France tomorrow." "Ah, goodbye, dear Lady Blakeney," exclaimed Chauvelin as Margot got into her carriage. "Did he keep his promise?" I wanted to know. Wait and see. As Margot and her husband left London in their carriage, she felt that she had to tell someone her secret. "I'm not surprised. 2 men's lives were in her hands." Many people thought Margot's husband was foolish, but she knew that he was the only person she could confide in. Chapter 7. A Secret. Back at home in London, Margot decided to tell her husband the whole story. She realized that she still loved him, and now she needed him more than ever. "How could a fool like Sir Percy help Margot?" I asked. Yes, but was he really as stupid as he seemed? As Margot told her husband about her brother and his terrible destiny, she was surprised by his reaction. The story seemed to touch Sir Percy deeply. He did his best to reassure her, and she realized that he was speaking so much more intelligently than usual. Was Margot seeing the real Sir Percy for the first time? Who was her husband? A simple idiot, or a clever, sensitive man? Could they be the same person? "Dear Margot, your brother will be safe," he promised her. When she heard these words, Margot went happily up to her bedroom. She fell into a deep sleep, thinking about her brother and her husband, the man she'd just discovered. In the middle of the night, Margot was woken up by a series of strange noises. Then, suddenly, silence. A full moon lit up the sky. Margot's eyes fell on something on the floor, and she got out of bed to investigate. There was a letter on the floor. "How did a letter get there in the middle of the night?" I wanted to know. "Come on now, you're not thinking." Margot opened the letter and read it. "Dear Margot, I must leave for the north, but I'll be back on Wednesday. Your servant, Percy Blakeney." Why was he going to the north? Remember that Sir Percy was an incredibly rich man. The Blakeneys had an estate in the north of England, and Sir Percy went to visit his properties from time to time. Still, Margot was surprised that her husband had left in the middle of the night. After all, they usually went together. "I'm sure he hasn't really gone to the north. He knows that Armand's in danger, and he promised to save him." Margot couldn't understand why her husband had left without her. She was filled with a strange feeling of curiosity. Suddenly, she was sure that the answer to all her questions was hidden in Sir Percy's study. Strangely enough, it was always locked, and no one was allowed to go there. Margot remembered that the key was in her husband's room. As quiet as a mouse, she opened the door, feeling like an intruder. She found a set of keys hidden in the desk. All she had to do was try them. That's just what she intended to do, Grandpa went on. But just as she reached Sir Percy's room, she stepped on something. Margot picked it up. It was a gold ring, and there was something engraved on it. She couldn't believe her eyes. "Let me guess. It was a tiny flower, the symbol of the Scarlet Pimpernel," I exclaimed. "How did you know?" "Sir Percy was the Scarlet Pimpernel. I can't believe it." Margot was amazed. Her husband was playing his part even better than her. Remember, I told you at the start of the story that Margot was an actress with the Comédie Française. I know. As usual, I finished Grandpa's sentence for him. Chapter 8. Margot Takes Action. Margot suddenly thought about Chauvelin and Armand. But that's terrible. She'd sacrificed her husband to save her brother. That's right, Grandpa continued. Margot was filled with despair. She'd helped Chauvelin find the Scarlet Pimpernel, but he was her husband. Now she risked losing the two men she loved. She had to take action. Margot remembered the note she found that evening at Lord Grenville's ball. I must leave for France tomorrow. Chauvelin had already guessed who the Scarlet Pimpernel was, but he hadn't said anything to Margot at the ball. One thing was certain. Chauvelin wanted to trap him. There was still time for Margot to act. She packed her bags and prepared for the journey to Calais, where all the boats from England arrived. Calais was her last chance, the only place she could save the Scarlet Pimpernel. Who knows which road he'll take to Paris, and how will I ever find him when he's there, she thought. Margot's saving the Scarlet Pimpernel. The roles are reversed, I exclaimed. Quite right. But remember, it was Margot who betrayed him. After all, she gave Chauvelin the information he needed to find him. And I suppose Calais was the easiest place for Chauvelin to set his trap. So Margot had to get there first to save her husband. She had to act faster than ever before. Margot travelled to Dover, then took a boat to Calais. The journey wasn't easy. Strong winds made the boat sail faster, but the sea was extremely rough. At last, Margot arrived in Calais. She was relieved to be back on land again. There were signs of the revolution everywhere in Calais, and all the men were wearing red caps with the revolutionaries' tricolour rosette. Margot went straight to the Chat Gris, the inn where all the English aristocrats stayed when they first arrived in Calais. If I'm lucky, she thought, my husband will be there. The revolutionaries had left their mark at the inn. Margot read what they'd written all over the walls. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. She reserved a room for the night, then went to speak to the owner of the inn. Sir, I have a very good friend who often comes here. He's always in Calais on business. He's a tall, elegantly dressed man. Have you seen him? She whispered. A tall Englishman, you say? Why, yes, he was here today. You saw him then? Of course. How could I forget such a fashionable man? But he's already left. It must be him, murmured Margot. Did you say that he's gone? She asked anxiously. Yes, madam, but he'll be back. He ordered dinner. So Chauvelin's plan had failed then? Yes, and Margot had never felt so happy, Grandpa explained. I'll see my husband again this evening, she thought. She was relieved that she'd arrived in time to save his life. Where was Chauvelin? Oh, Chauvelin was in Calais too. He wanted to look for the Scarlet Pimpernel in secret, so he disguised himself as a priest. But Margot still had to warn her husband, didn't she? The Scarlet Pimpernel couldn't change his plans, I said. What plans? Grandpa, you're the one telling the story. The Scarlet Pimpernel had gone to France to save Margot's brother, Armand, and the Count de Tournay. Of course, of course. He couldn't abandon the people who trusted him. Now, where was I? Ah, yes. Chapter 9. The Trap Closes. Do you remember the note that Margot found? Grandpa asked. It proved that Armand was in league with the Scarlet Pimpernel. Yes, and Chauvelin had promised to give it back to Margot. That's right. Now, the note also described a secret hiding place where Armand, the Count de Tournay, and other members of the League were all hiding. Père Blanchard's hut, as they called it, was just outside Calais. Back at the Chat Gris, Margot was certain that her husband was out of danger. She sat down to rest in a comfortable armchair near the fireplace. The chair had its back to the door, so Margot couldn't see who came in. The room was so quiet, and the fire so warm and reassuring, that she began to feel sleepy. Suddenly, she heard a noise. Somebody was coming in. Her husband! I exclaimed. This time you're wrong. She heard the voice of the Scarlet Pimpernel's mortal enemy, Chauvelin. Margot was so terrified she couldn't move. She sat as quietly as she could, listening to the conversation between Chauvelin and his assistant, Degas. "What's the latest?" Chauvelin whispered. "We carried out all your orders, sir. I positioned my men outside Père Blanchard's hut. They saw some men go in. We know that Armand, the Count de Tournay, and members of the Scarlet Pimpernel's band are hiding there." "What about the Scarlet Pimpernel?" "He isn't coming to the inn. You're wasting your time. We heard that he'll be at the hut any minute." Chauvelin couldn't believe his ears. "Impossible! Come on, we must go there at once. I don't want to miss that damned Englishman." "A cart is waiting for us outside. The driver knows the road well. He says we'll be at the hut in 5 minutes. He's the one who told us that the Scarlet Pimpernel is going to the hut." "How did he know that?" Chauvelin asked. "Simple. His brother drives a cart too. He hired it to a man who looks like the Scarlet Pimpernel a quarter of an hour ago." "Excellent. Come on, there's no time to waste. Let's go to the hut." The two men ran out of the inn. Margot had heard every word of their conversation. As soon as they'd gone, she went out after them. She had to get to the hut and warn her husband before it was too late. Margot ran as fast as she could, gasping for breath. There was no time to waste, but she hadn't thought of hiring a horse or a cart. She could only think of one thing: warning the Scarlet Pimpernel. I was curious. Did she catch Chauvelin's cart? Well, she certainly tried her best. After all, her husband's life was in danger, and the road was in such bad condition that the cart couldn't go very fast. Alone in the dark, Margot ran for her life. Could she complete the last stage in her terrible journey? Chapter 10. It's the Scarlet Pimpernel. Margot tried to catch the cart, but soon she was exhausted. She was still 100 meters behind Chauvelin and Degas. The road took her along the coast, and in the moonlight Margot could see the Daydream, her husband's boat. "I remember," I interrupted. "Armand took the Daydream to France at the beginning of the story." "That's it." And when Margot saw the boat, waiting for its captain, she found the strength she needed to complete her mission. At last, she saw a light coming from a hut in the distance. All she had to do now was find Chauvelin. She must go through the woods. "One last effort, Margot." But just as she came to the woods, Margot lost her balance and fell over. As she was trying to get up, she saw a man in the shadows. He came forward, holding out his hand to help her. Margot had just enough time to see the terrifying face of her enemy before a soldier put a gag over her mouth. "What a pleasant surprise!" Chauvelin exclaimed. "Now, I'm sure your husband is nearby." Margot was filled with despair. She began to cry. "Margot, I've decided to take off your gag." "But that's mad," I interrupted again. "She'll scream." "We'll see. Here's what happened next. Your brother is hiding in that hut, Margot," Chauvelin went on, "and you have the power to save him. All you have to do is keep quiet. If you scream, he'll be shot with the others. Only you can choose. Now, I'm going to take off your gag." "What a terrible man!" Of course, Margot couldn't let her brother die. In a last desperate attempt to save him, she ran towards the hut. she shouted as loudly as she could, "Armand! Armand! Fire! Your leader has been betrayed! He's coming to the hut!" "What did Chauvelin do, Grandpa?" He told his men to catch Margot and search the hut. "No one must come out alive," he added furiously. Chauvelin's men ran towards it, but when they opened the door, they stopped. Chauvelin, who was waiting for them to shoot, shouted at the top of his voice, "What are you waiting for, you imbeciles?" The hut is empty, sir," answered one of his men. Red with anger, Chauvelin went inside with Degas behind him. Chauvelin turned angrily to Degas. "I told you not to let anyone leave." "You told us to wait for your orders, sir. In fact, half an hour ago we saw a group of men leave the hut, but you hadn't told us what to do, so we did nothing." Chauvelin's face was even redder now. "Sir," Degas said suddenly, "I found a note." He read it out to the other soldiers. "If I come to the hut, you'll all be in danger. After you've read this note, you must leave the hut one by one. Go to the beach. One of my men will be there with a boat. He'll take you all to the Daydream. Meet me in the port of Calais." When he heard this, Chauvelin regrouped his men, and they prepared to leave for Calais. He was in such a hurry that he forgot about Margot. She was lying on the ground, unconscious. "How did he get to Calais, Grandpa?" "He took the horse and cart. He threw the driver to the ground, but the poor man insisted that he wanted to take them to Calais himself. 'Your Honour,' said the driver, 'I know a shortcut.' 'You idiot! My trap has failed because of you. I've never seen anyone drive so slowly.' Chauvelin collected his soldiers, and they left for Calais. The driver rushed over to Margot to help her. "Lady Blakeney, wake up," he whispered gently. Margot thought it was all a dream. The driver was none other than Sir Percy, the Scarlet Pimpernel. "Margot, Margot, look at me." Margot wasn't dreaming. It really was her husband. When she heard his voice, she opened her eyes and began to cry. "Don't speak, Margot. I know everything. You're a true heroine. You did everything to save us." I did not understand. "But how did the Scarlet Pimpernel warn his men when they were in the hut?" It was simple. When the guards weren't looking, he climbed up towards the hut and pushed a note under the door. His men read the note one by one, then made their escape. "So how did they get back to England?" "How do you think? Do you really think the Daydream went to Calais? Remember the last line of the note. Meet me in the port of Calais." It was all a trap for Chauvelin. "And the trap certainly worked. I suppose he hated everyone so much he couldn't see the truth." The captain of the Daydream stayed in the port. Then he sent out a smaller boat to look for the Scarlet Pimpernel and his men. "All's well that ends well, then." Grandpa laughed. "For tonight, at least. It's time for bed now. But there'll be plenty more adventures for the Scarlet Pimpernel."